Hello, and welcome to Class 7 of Theory of World Politics. Today we're going to focus on the study of international politics beyond the human, or post-anthropocentric study of world politics. The usual reminder that there is also a reading and a quiz that accompanies the class, as well as an online material, which for today is a documentary film about Vik Muni's social art activism project in Brazil with waste pickers. Hopefully you find this interesting and worthwhile and relevant to the discussion that this class focuses on. So let me share the slides with you. Okay, hopefully that's visible. Good. So perhaps by way of introduction, let me say that world politics as a kind of domain or subfield of the study of political phenomena, processes, and ideas has been, in traditional sense, largely conceived as an entirely and exclusively human affair. So we could call it human-centric, right? The imaginary of a human-centric world. In such an imaginary, animals, plants, environments, different biotic and non-biotic items are considered to amount to little more than objects upon which humans act. So if you like the analogy of a theater, right? If world politics was a theater or a stage, right? It's the humans who are actors in world politics, and non-humans are kind of background to the story or props that are necessary, but they don't act. They might be necessary and important, but they do not act on their own volition. It's the humans who are sole agents and actors and authors of political events. Now, today, in today's world, it has been harder and it has become harder and harder to sort of embrace this anthropocentric or human-centric model without challenging it, right? So diverse events and developments that are often clustered together under the shared rubric of climate crisis have thrown this mode of thinking into trouble or into a huge turmoil. So today we're going to go over that issue or address that issue, highlighting scholarship in world politics that have sought to break away from that paradigm of knowledge that relegates to the non-humans merely the place of a backdrop, right, against which humans act, exert power, and control. So how are we going to do that? Sorry. Okay, there we go. Class plan. First, I'm going to give you a broad overview over those two different modes of knowledge or scholarship. One called anthropocentrism, so the more traditional one, the one that I just suggest that is in huge crisis. And then post-anthropocentric perspective or study of international politics. Second, within the post-anthropocentric study of world politics, we can, of course, differentiate different strands. And I'm going to highlight two main ones. One I call decentering the human, and the other one complicating the human. Third, we're going to go over some of the key concepts in the study of world politics beyond human. So the ones I've chosen for you is the idea or theory of vibrant matter, as well as concepts of affordance, assemblage, and actance. And then in the second half of the class, I'm going to talk a little bit about waste and also say a few words about the online material, which also focuses on waste and practices of waste picking, and helps us cast into relief the problem of post-anthropocentric world politics in close alignment with questions of social agency and sociopolitical inequalities between so across global south, global north. Good. So let's move to it. The paradigm shift from anthropocentric world politics to post-anthropocentric world politics requires that we ask, what do these models even consist of? What are their characteristics? In the traditional paradigm, so the one that's rooted in humanistic assumption about the centrality of the human in politics, right? What we encounter is basically a model, right, that is graphically expressed as a kind of pyramid, as you can see. So the human is the central actor, is on top, right? Is a kind of, we could say, universal figure. I mean, it is what you see on the slide is the figure is gendered, but otherwise we don't see any, for example, racial characteristics, right, of the person. It's not a differentiated category. What is important is that the human in this model is endowed with political and moral capacities to order and reorder the world. So even when faced with problems of, let's call it environmental nature, like the rise of global temperatures or loss of biodiversity, it is the human that is tasked with addressing and solving it. So this is important to remember, that environmental policy does not always translate into post-anthropocentric. It is quite possible, quite feasible to have an anthropocentric environmental policy or do study of environmental policy from anthropocentric perspective. As a knowledge paradigm, the importance of this pyramid model, right, with the human on top and then all the other beings sort of arranged below. The important thing about this is that it's a kind of version of life that is organized according to a principle of from most complex to most quote unquote primitive, but that what counts as complexity is basically similarity to human life forms. So the human is a kind of blueprint for the superior, the most accomplished, the most developed, the most complex. This, of course, could be a biological discourse, right? There are examples of that historically, but it's also a socio-political discourse. It translates into political terms, right? In that the pyramid can also signify structures of authority and control. On the other side of your slide, you can see post-anthropocentrism and some of its key characteristics. So here there is a very different model, graphic representation, no longer a pyramid, but a circle, a circular graphic. It illustrates a movement away from a hierarchical thinking about diverse life forms to a model that is, scientific, but it's also legal, political, we could say perhaps it's also ethical, of non-hierarchical endorsement of diversity of life forms. Right? What post-anthropocentrism calls into question is, first of all, the idea of hierarchy and privilege of the category of the human, but also that which counts as a human. So the very kind of uniformity and universality within which the sign, the human, is used. Post-anthropocentrism, even though I'm using it in singular, it is in fact a term that covers a broad range of scholarly approaches, even just within world politics, different points of focus and different assumptions and different scholarly goals in terms of knowledge production. So there is no uniformity. And I just want to suggest two trajectories. This isn't really exhausting the topic, but by way of introduction, what post-anthropocentric study of world politics might mean. So the first sort of dominant approach, post-anthropocentric approach, is basically a study of political systems, of world political systems and dynamics that refuse to position the human as a privileged and sole actor in history, right? So they challenge then the reduction of whatever does not fit within the rubric of the human, so non-human life form, to this uniform category non-human, right, that is assigned meaning according to its instrumental use value for humans, right? How useful is that for humans? How similar it is to humans? And instead, it proposes a more ecocentric or biocentric epistemic alternative. So the goal is to pluralize political agency, right? To be able to think, analyze, conceptualize a political agency that does not evolve, does not only include humans, and also this to study then the impact that non-human or other than human beings can have in particular political constellations. There are many examples of scholarship that take this perspective. I have just made one reference to Dina Shelton's work. There is a link to an article that Shelton published in 2015. And this is specifically focusing on recognizing legal personhood of nature in international and national law. Right? We spoke of human rights in a previous class, but here the importance is of the advocacy of biotic rights, okay, in recent discourses. So, of course, we might be familiar with animal rights. The history of animal rights goes a bit farther back than the rights of other non-human beings, right? Here there is specifically the question of whether nature can have legal personality and with what world political consequences. There is also a second trend or trajectory in post-anthropocentric study of IR, and that's a scholarship that doesn't simply dethrone or decenter the human, I mean, simply as if this was a simple task, but also wants to critically crack open, if you like, the very category or the sign of the human, right? So I did mention before that within anthropocentric study of world politics, the human is often considered a kind of all-encompassing universal category that includes the entire species of human, right? So it's quite broad and it's quite unifying. Now, the critical response, post-anthropocentric response, asks what particular and historically specific versions, right, or subject positions of the human, in fact, come into view. The suggestion is that that the category of the human isn't only excluding others, right? So animal, plants, fungi, what have you, but that in fact, it is itself caught up in this regime of inclusion and exclusion, which is to say that some humans, by the virtue of being racialized or gendered in particular way, are defined as being inferior to other forms of this universal human, but in fact, it's a universalized, historically particular subject, right? And those exclusions or this kind of categorization often comes through thinking about racialized, orientalized, or gendered subjects as being closer to nature, right? As being more animal-like. And this is actually historically a very common discourse in colonialism, in European colonialism. The text assigned for today will hopefully expand more that question of the paradigm shift from anthropocentric to post-anthropocentric study of international politics. What I would like to focus now is to give you a specific example of post-anthropocentric scholarship, just because up until now I've been thinking or talking about it in somewhat general terms. So to be a little bit more precise, I wanted to mention a book published slightly over 10 years ago by American political theorist Jane Bennett. The title of the book is Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, and it's precisely an attempt to rethink basic political theoretical categories if we take a more complex and non-human centric view of nature. So Jane Bennett's starting premise in that project is quite simple. She argues that non-human entities that surround us, of course, animals, plants, but she thinks about it very broadly. So she writes that the subject of her books are edibles, commodities, storms, and metals, right? And of course, way beyond it. But this isn't a book that is only focused on animals or animals and plants. So rather than being objects upon which humans act in a variety of ways, they are all what she calls lively things. This means that non-human entities for Bennett need to be recognized as endowed with a form of vitality, with a form of life. They are not only acted upon, molded, right? But they act, she says, as quasi-agents or as forces, I quote, with trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own. Bennett captures this idea with the concept that is also in the title of her book, Vibrant Matter. And she means vibrant here in a very literal sense. So vibrant means lively or full of life, right? Animate as opposed to inanimate or dead. Non-human entities for her are then co-creators of the world. And she means both physical world, the natural world, but also the social, cultural, and political. In fact, the social and the natural or the biotic are inseparable for Bennett in her book, in her theory. Vibrancy then captures the idea that materiality is something that needs to be recognized as potent, as something that's endowed and with capacity to make an impact, to affect, to exert power. Okay? She, in fact, writes about think power as a form of power that political theorists, world political theorists, need to reckon with and recognize. Bennett asks, right? So we could ask then a kind of so what question, like what are the consequences for world politics if we adopt this more complex and less human-centric view of matter? And she asks, she answers this question through a series of questions of her own. Right? So she asks, how would patterns of consumption change if we faced not litter, rubbish, trash, or the recycling, but an accumulating pile of lively and potentially dangerous matter? Right? What difference would it make to public health, right? So policies around public health, if eating was understood as an encounter, right? So not internalization of some kind of object, but an encounter, a form of a meeting between various and variegated bodies, diverse bodies, right? So our body coming, a human body in the process of eating, coming into contact, encountering other bodies. Some of them mine, most of them not, none of which always gets the upper hand, all right? What issues would surround stem cell research in the absence of the assumption that the only source of vitality in matter is soul or spirit? What difference would it make to the course of energy policy were electricity to be figured not simply as a resource, commodity, right, or instrumentality basically objects we use, we deal with, but also and more radically an actant. So in a moment, I will explain what actant means, but let's just say, let's use it as a placeholder, and let's for now tentatively say an actor. What if electricity were to be figured and recognized as a world political actor? The think power here means that objects are basically irreducible to the meanings to the sense that we make of them, to the meanings that we assign to them, to our interpretations, to our human agenda. Progressive environmental thinking, but also, of course, more broadly, progressive policy more broadly, is premised, you can see, Bennett makes it quite clear through the different questions she asks, on this rethinking of things, if you like, away from reductive notions of being, well, objects to be used, right, to be instrumentalized, problems to be solved, tools to be employed, right, and into a more complex kind of complex set of ideas where power is and control are dispersed. Bennett follows this up by asking, why advocate the vitality of matter, right? So in other words, she asks, what is the point of this book? Because, she answers, my hunch is that the image of dead and thoroughly instrumentalized matter feeds human hubris and our earth-destroying fantasies of conquest and consumption. So these are kind of approaches, political approaches, that are rooted in anthropocentric worldview. I continue. It does so by preventing us from detecting, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling, a fuller range of non-human powers that are circulating around and within human bodies. These material powers, right? So you've got a theory of power extended beyond the human here, which can aid or destroy, enrich or disable, ennoble or degrade us. In any case, call for our attentiveness, or even, quote unquote, respect. Bennett makes it very clear here that limitations or inadequacies of our policies, environmental politics first and foremost, but of course not only, are due to, or at least partly due to, the fact that our imaginary of the human world is incredibly impoverished, right? It's very limited, because we view it as basically void of life, as void of power, as reduced to something we are always able to control, as long as we, at least potentially able to control, something reduced to the meanings, value, and uses that humans ascribe to it. So hopefully that is clear. Let me now outline 3 concepts in post-anthropocentric world politics. Introduce 3 concepts. I call them 3 A's because each one of them starts with the letter A. And that's a concept of the actant, of affordance, and of assemblage. Let's take them one by one. First, the concept of actant. The concept of actant was developed in the first line by French sociologist of science, Bruno Latour, as an alternative to the concept of agency. So it's an actancy or actant, it's an attempt of thinking about agency outside of the human-centric premises upon which our notion of agency is based. So what is problematic and limiting about the concept of agency is that when it comes with a baggage of assumptions, even when we don't spell them out. So we might say an agent and we imagine a human or a human-like being, right? Which is to say that being an agent or acting in and upon the world is sort of dependent on all sorts of characteristics like being kind of purposeful and deliberate engagement in and with the world, something intentional, something we have planned, right? It's synonymous with setting a goal for oneself that one wants to achieve with volition, with will, with communication, right? And with other mental faculties such as deliberation, imagination, memory, and so on. Okay. So actancy basically appears or is coined because there is a need to dissociate theories of power from this human-centric view of agency. The non-human bodies become actants in the world, not because they are intentional, because they set goals for themselves, because they reveal signs of what we call volition, but because they form different constellations and networks with other things. So while they might be stripped of those human qualities or properties that accompany our conception of action, they are nevertheless actants. They nevertheless affect and exert effects in the world. Like Latour says, that actant, that quote, can literally be anything, provided it is a source of action. And then he says also that actant is basically any entity, so anything that modifies another entity. So it's a much broader, right, not exclusively human notion, idea of action. The second concept is affordance. So I find that concept sometimes puzzles my students, but then I always remind them, because it's not something that they hear or they have ever heard, then I always remind them that even without the use of the word affordance, they deal with affordance and they rely on affordance in basically anything they do in their daily lives. The concept of affordance, it was first coined in 1970 in the field of ecological psychology, and it basically means the possibility for action that reside in the object, right? So it's similar to an inclination or a propensity. To give you a very simple example, right? A door is, the door can be an example of affordance because it affords activities of opening and closing. A pen or a pencil, also, we could talk about affordance. A pen affords writing, right? A mug affords holding water, me drinking, being washed, but also being broken, right? It affords, I could maybe use it as I don't know, as a creative material, or I could use it as a weapon. So there's sort of quite unlimited, at least with some objects, affordance. This is what's called the logic of propensity, right? It helps us rethink action, political action as well, as something that isn't linked to the logic of means and end, right? Where these objects are basically tools of human volition, okay? At best, they can malfunction, but here action is something dispositional, okay? It's something relational. It has to do with the kind of objects leaning to behave in particular way, enabling and disabling my own action within the framework that they provide and that I am also part of. So it is linked to embodiment as well, more closely, and it's related to impact and effect. Shortly, we're going to talk about waste and garbage, right? Which in anthropocentric discourses are these quintessential passive objects, right? So that we produce, we manage, we control, we deal with. But if we think about waste as an actant, and if we think about waste from the perspective of affordance, a much more kind of complex and more enriched understanding of its environmental placement or environmental function and environmental impact come into view, right? Suddenly we need to think about waste from the perspective of relations, of differential groupings and networks, and what waste makes possible, enables, and also what it disables. And then finally, the concept of assemblage. I'll only touch here on it, like there is a lot of literature on assemblage. I would like us just to think about assemblage as in very basic terms, as a kind of collection or gathering of things. It can also include people, of course, but the idea is that behind so-called assemblage thinking is that rather than ask ourselves, what are the most basic and constitutive units of our world, right? Of politics, of culture, society, as single items or entities or bodies that then can enter into relationships with one another, let's think about the grouping or assemblage of these items as the kind of a relational cluster or network as the basic unit, right? So it's the total sum of actants that make up something, a thing, right? I often, again, give an example that is very basic, so I hope you don't mind, because that I sometimes speak about these very basic things rather than world political phenomena. But think about, just as we were thinking about door with affordance, with assemblage, think about something like a birthday cake, right? Of course, we could say that birthday cake is an outcome, a product of primary composites. So you couldn't have a birthday cake if you didn't have, well, I don't know what it is that these days you could probably make a cake without anything. But let's say it's, like you need to have sugar to make a birthday cake. You need to have flour to make a cake. You need to have eggs and so on, depending, of course, what cake you like. But with assemblage thinking, we take the birthday cake as a starting point of departure, as a kind of a network, all right? That has come, that functions in a way like like a composite or a network that brings within itself not only these material objects, but also devices and labor that's used to make it, such as the oven, manpower, female power, male and female power of like kneading a cake or mixing it, a wooden spoon or a spatula, whatever you're using, right? So, and then these actants, of course, can be broken further into different materials, units of power, labor, and so on. So how things are arranged, how they are fitted and fixed together, and what they make, again, possible. Right, so I'm going to move to the topic of waste now. This is a massive topic in international environmental politics and world politics. So I'm not able to exhaust it, but what I was trying to achieve with that slide that you can see, that has different components or different perspectives on waste or aspect of waste, and with the different sort of shades of like gray and brownish, are different angles from which you can approach the question of waste. So it could be most literal, conceptual, definitional. It could be from the perspective of material and social processes. And then what's at the very bottom, it's also, you can think about waste from an epistemological and philosophical symbolic perspective as well. So I'm just going to touch upon them without being able to exhaust that fully. How is waste a world political problem or world political issue? This is the question we need to ask ourselves to kind of guide us through this labyrinth of perspectives and aspects of waste. The first, of course, is international law and international norms that regulate waste-related practices. What is frequently mentioned in this context is that there isn't really a uniform framework, right? With the exception of regulations around radioactive waste and hazardous waste, that indeed have seen development of international law and a convention in 1989, so-called Basel Convention. There is no systematic international collaboration on waste that would go beyond maybe ad hoc policies and ad hoc regional collaborations. I mean, EU is perhaps the most advanced, so Europe in collaboration around the topic of waste, but that's more of an exception than the rule. And the EU Waste Framework Directive, which is the kind of platform within which the collaboration takes place, has been critiqued as not being ambitious enough or sufficiently ambitious. The definition around waste kind of cast into relief the fact that waste is a word or term that we use all the time, but of course it's also a formal rubric. So Moisi, for example, differentiates between garbage, trash, and waste as having sort of different meanings, different uses, different etymologies, but that especially in daily parlance are often used interchangeably. Michael Thompson, in now a classic book called Rubbish Theory, The Creation and Destruction of Value, gives us a really useful, I think, taxonomy of thinking about waste as a kind of a product that's caught up in the problem of the life of objects. And Thompson differentiates between, on the one hand, what he calls the durable object, right? So these are objects that maintain their value over time or that increase the value over time. So works of art are perhaps the clearest example of that. Then there are the transient objects, so the objects that decrease in value, and that's most of our everyday tools and belongings. And then finally, and this is where waste comes in, there is rubbish. So basically objects that have zero and unchanging value. What's interesting about this taxonomy is that we can kind of use it to make sense of different things that happen to and with waste. So if you like, waste affordance, right? Because practices, socio-material practices of reuse, recycling, upcycling, repair, and so on, could be considered here a way of restoring the status of these objects from that of rubbish to that of transient things. There are other typologies of waste. So the one that you can see on the slide farthest to the right is perhaps most common, and that's depending on the type of an object that is classified as waste, which is such a broad category. When you think about what we call waste, these objects have nothing in common with one another. So that begs a question, what makes all those things waste? There is hazardous waste and radioactive waste, okay, produced by different industries. E-waste, which is a very like a huge part of the waste in developed economies, with a very notorious recycling rate of the quarter only, I think, of e-waste is currently recycled. Another big category is medical waste, of course, and another set of challenges of how to deal with it. And then finally, the distinction between commercial and household waste. So commercial waste, of course, is a kind of a byproduct of different types of industries. Below that, we can, another set of perspectives on the waste as a world political problem is regarding the reporting, measuring, and creation of data around waste. This is an incredibly difficult problem on a global scale. It's very difficult to report on waste. And that's because countries have such different definition of what waste is and what falls into that category. And they also have different ways of measuring and reporting. So that's one big kind of obstacle. We can also talk about the cost of waste. There is economic cost, of course. There is the one that has most coverage in media, perhaps, today, and that's the environmental cost of waste, including different forms of contamination and contribution of waste to greenhouse gas emissions. But there is also implied in it, and I think we really need to mention it as well. We will see it addressed in the online material, the Vic Mooney's documentary, the social cost of waste. Right? So the cost of waste that involved in the labor of dealing with waste and how it sort of filters through categories of class. At the very bottom of the slide, there is a few of these kind of boxes that I put there by way of trying to complexify the question of waste. Here we can think of waste as a world political problem from the perspective of it corresponding to certain normative order, okay? So we already said that waste is a kind of an interesting but very puzzling word because it covers objects that have basically nothing in common with one another, right? From whatever perspective you look at. So what makes them waste? What makes us classify them as waste? I'm borrowing here from one of the kind of structuralist classics in anthropology of waste and dirt, Mary Douglas' well-known book from the 60s called, beautiful title, Purity and Danger, right? But also from her later essays on pollution. And Mary Douglas makes a proposition that there is no such thing as absolute kind of dirt. There is no such thing as waste, objects that is sort of in and of itself. No single item is kind of waste outside of a system that classifies it as such because that object does not fit. So this is really important. This is really key. Like, what is the unifying rubric of waste, right? There are objects that manifest through our kind of perception of them as being out of place, right? Transgressing or going against certain ordered set of relations. So this might sound very academic, very theoretical, but think about very common examples. Again, I think that is something that we encounter every day, even though we wouldn't use those concepts perhaps always or these kind of theories to make sense of, or even maybe we wouldn't even puzzle over what's happening. But think about covering of fruit and vegetables that we use, right, in cooking. And the vegetable might look very appetizing on your plate, or just look very appetizing. And then you remove the covering and suddenly the covering is waste. We wouldn't, or not everybody would think, okay, now I can collect these peels, maybe I'll wash them and I will use them to make a broth or something, right? So just something that just a moment ago was desirable, we wanted to put it into our bodies, food on a plate. 15 minutes later, leftovers, the same food, no one wants to eat it, right? it's the blah, we want to remove it and throw it out. Or an aesthetic wrapper on a gift, right? That's what makes the gift special. It's beautiful, it appeals to us at some kind of aesthetic level. And then 30 seconds later, the gift is unwrapped. Someone rolls the paper, throws it on the floor, and then what, we pick it up and we put it in, it becomes a waste object. So from being kind of the extremely pleasing, aesthetic, beautiful thing, it becomes a waste, out of place object. Just to add a few things, and then we're going to move to the specific case study of waste management and waste picking in the waste landfill in Brazil. a few more things that I want to add, and they will be important for us making sense of the documentary. One is the recognition of dealing with waste as labor, okay? That's often rendered invisible, okay? That's often gendered, that globally, at least speaking, is often racialized as well. So connected to, for example, forms of migration, right? Domestic labor and care labor, which is an important part of tackling waste, right? So human waste here, raises all sorts of important questions about domestic outsourcing of domestic labor, questions of global citizenship, globally pressing environmental issues, implicating with those very, very closely. Finally, to point to two remaining aspects of waste. One of them is really important kind of critique that came from critical discussions of capitalism, right? That suggests that waste is not so much an object, a difficult object for us to deal with, recycle, reuse, but it's a symptom. It's an outcome of the excess that is kind of the unwanted surplus, but also the necessary surplus of capitalism, right? So it's a kind of manifestation that capitalism produces endless waste, that elimination of waste goes against the nature of capitalism. And so it is the problem of capitalism that needs to be addressed if we want to resolve in some satisfactory way the questions of waste production. And then finally, the post kind of humanist literature on waste is also very interesting because it wants to think about actancy or agency of waste that somehow strikes back. Edinson, you will find that book in the extensive literature for the course, writes about waste that strikes back by bearing onto our senses. Okay. Let me read that. The acute acidity of industrial chemicals and rotting of dead substance may assault the nostrils. The face may suddenly become enveloped in a thick veil of cobwebs. The clatter of a swinging light fitment in the wind may cause a sharp fright. The slipperiness of greasy shop floor in the rain might coerce a slithery dance. Unable to insulate ourselves against these material intrusions, the body is rendered porous, open to the impacts of matter, is a threshold or passage characterized by multiple surfaces open to other surfaces through which strange substances are able to cross the subject's own boundaries. End of quote. So this doesn't exhaust, right? These aspects don't exhaust the question of waste, but I think pointing to the kind of diversity of issues, aspects, and perspective that arise when we consider waste as a world political question. I would like to now exemplify this by introducing one kind of large landfill based in Brazil. That's also the subject of the documentary that I hope all of you will watch. That's available online on YouTube. And that's the Metropolitan landfill that was, now it's actually closed. It closed a few years back. It was placed just outside of Rio in a site called Jardim Gramacho. Right? This is where it was one of the world's largest landfills. It was actually the largest if you look at it from the perspective of volume. But basically it was 90 meters high, so imagine that height, spanning across 14 square kilometers. So It's like from the university campus in Jyväskylä to the almost to the airport, but think about it as a square, okay, and 90 centimeters long. It was opened in 1970, just outside of Rio, and ecologically, it was a very problematic decision because it was placed on these sensitive wetlands, right? So very sort of unstable terrain, and it had incredibly destructive impact on those wetlands themselves, receiving thousands of tons of fresh garbage daily. What you will see in the documentary is a Brazilian artist, at that time, very well-known artist who received acclaim in North America, Vic Muniz, undertaking an artistic or social activist artistic project of using garbage in Jardim Gramacho in photography. Okay. And in this way, bringing or giving visibility to not only the environmental, material problems of waste, but also social and political precarities of people who inhabit in its proximity, right? So the Jardim Gramacho is surrounded by favelas, by slum cities, and there's groups of people who are basically exposed daily to it, to its environment, and also to like health consequences of living adjacent to such a site, but for whom it also provides a source of income. So the focus of the film is on of the project is on garbage pickers that undertake all sorts of sorting activities undertook all sorts of activities in Jardim Gramacho. So about 3,000 garbage pickers were collecting 200 tons of recyclable material per day. Lucy Walker, and this is from an article in The Guardian. Lucy Walker is the director of this film, Wasteland. She brings out, and I'll read you a quote, the complexity, the interweaving of the environmental, the social, and artistic in Vic Muniz's project. Right? So Lucy Walker says, I quote, "The garbage is the only place in Rio where the social extremes get mixed together. The posh rubbish from the South Zone mixes, with the cheap trash from the favelas. Garbage is the negative of consumer culture. It's everything that nobody wants, and when it disappears from everyone's lives, rich or poor, it doesn't disappear at all. It appears here like a conjuring trick gone wrong." So waste pickers, you will see that the term they use, this is in Brazilian Portuguese, is catadores, right? So workers who salvage recyclable material. They do very important work, right, that has environmental impact, right? Reducing pollution, mitigating climate change, but also impact on public health, sanitation, as well as basically filling a niche where there is an absence of public services for sorting rubbish. Right? And they are, so ironically, they of course also a source of municipal savings. Having said that, this is a work that comes at enormous cost. So we could kind of think about it psycho-socially. Right? There are physical occupational hazards like health risks, risks of injury, but there's also social stigma and broader social costs. Keep in mind as you watch the documentary that the kind of key characteristic is that they are very well unionized. So they are associated workers. And in fact, that's like kind of an adjacent issue that some of the world's most active and established waste pickers or organizations have historically developed in South America. So Brazil is one of them, but also waste pickers in Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay have formed Latin American waste picker network, in which there are waste picker movements from well, 16 countries, and they exchange knowledge and organize themselves in kind of transnational solidarity and promote development of leadership and committees. Good. So let me just bring it to a close now. These are some of the things that I would like you to be aware of as you watch the documentary. I'm going to just show you a few images to finish off with, but of course, when you watch the documentary, you will have a good sense of them as the kind of finished products, but also the process that went into creating these artworks. So these are basically, I was trying to capture in those images their how they look as completed works, but also to give you a kind of a close-up image in case this isn't quite visible, that these images are basically created from the material with which these workers operate every day. But of course, these images were also created by them. So Vik Muniz kind of photographed them, but then employed some of the waste pickers, many of the waste pickers, to help him create that artwork. Okay, so I think I'll stop sharing. This is about it. I hope you have found it informative and clear. And again, a reminder to please remember to complete the quiz that's associated with today's class. Thanks very much for your attention, and see you next time.